नहमदु व नसल्ली अला रसूलिहिल करीम अम्मा बाद फ़अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम रब्बि इश्रह ली सदरी व यस्सिर ली अमरी वहलुल उक़दतम मिन लिसानी यफ़क़हू क़ौली रब्बना ज़िदना इल्मा अल्लाहुम्मा फ़क़्क़िहना फ़िद्दीन अल्लाहुम्मा इन्नी अस्अलुका इल्मन नाफ़िआ व अमलन मुतक़ब्बला व रिज़्क़न तय्यबा अल्लाहुम्मा अन्फ़अना बिमा अल्लमतना व अल्लिमना मा यनफ़अुना व ज़िदना इल्मा अल्लाहुम्मा इन्नी अऊज़ु बिका मिन इल्मिन ला यनफ़अु व मिन क़ल्बिन ला यख़शअु व मिन नफ़्सिन ला तशबअु व मिन दअवतिन ला युस्तजाबु लहा. So inshallah today the main focus of our lesson today is the brief history of Bani Israel. I will start a little bit with the not review but to give you an idea of how these lessons that we've studied so far, how they are connected and how they connect to our upcoming lessons inshallah. So when we started Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the introduction about many things that we will see in the world, the different types of people, the pious and the kafir and the hypocrites. And keep in mind that it's not just the introduction of the people that we will meet, we will ourselves be in one of these three categories. So we should be very wise and very aware and very conscious about which category we choose to be in. After that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also introduced how Allah is the sustainer, He is the Rabb, He's taking care of everything by showing us how He has created even the heavens and the earth and all the other systems that Allah has put in place, like the water cycle, the food chains and everything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also showed us our own life cycle, how we are given life and death and life again. We don't have a choice, or we are completely helpless. So this shows us our own status as compared to our Rabb. Then we were also shown the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the people around us and the world itself. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught us how to be a humble person, how to be somebody who can learn knowledge and wisdom with open mind, open heart and humility. So at that time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught us the people who don't want to learn, they are fasiqeen and they don't have a good relationship with in all three aspects, with their Rabb, with the people around them and with the world they live in. They are corruptors. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduced us to the origin of human being by telling us how Adam alayhi salam, the first human being, was formed, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided to make him, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him better than all the other creatures in the world by the gift of knowledge. And so much so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked the angels to prostrate to him. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also introduced Iblis, Shaitan, that he will be the main open enemy throughout a human's life. Now, during that story, we learned many lessons, and one important thing that is going to connect our future lessons is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned to Adam alayhi salam that this is a place, the earth, where all the human beings will live for some time, meaning there is an end time, which means there is a day of judgment for everyone, and then it will be decided if they will go into Jannah or hellfire. And this will be based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also mentioned at that time, that He will send guidance, meaning He will send prophets every now and then for reminding people about the right path. So religion given was Islam, and it will stay Islam, and we know that many prophets came from Adam alayhi salam to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who was the last prophet of Islam. He was the Khatimun Nabiyyin, meaning the seal of the prophets, meaning the last prophet. So we are going to study about Bani Israel and how this is connected. There, of course, Quran mentions many prophets, not all the prophets that were sent on the earth, but many prophets are mentioned, and then we will study a little bit about them as it will come in our ayat. Over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces to us the Bani Israel, usually studied with the prophethood of Musa alayhi salam, although there were many other prophets also sent to Bani Israel. Bani Israel is the study about Jews and how they became Jews, and whether Judaism was given to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, it was not. As I said already, that the religion was always Islam. And Allah had said that there will be guidance sent. But some people still make their own groups, and we'll see how they got distracted and how they deviated from the right path. So we'll start this story from Ibrahim alayhi salam. Why? Because all the people of the book, all the three religions, the Judaism, the Christianity and Islam, they all believe in and respect Ibrahim alayhi salam, and they are also called Abrahamic religions. So it all starts from Ibrahim alayhi salam, who is also called the father of the prophets, because all the prophets who came after Ibrahim alayhi salam, they were from his children only. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was born in Iraq, and from his very young age only, he did not like it that people would worship the idols. He used to see them and did not approve of it, and especially it bothered him a lot that his father was a sculptor, and he was a very strict polytheist, and so much so that as Ibrahim alayhi salam was growing up, his father was amongst the people who was willing to throw him in fire, because Ibrahim alayhi salam used to preach to them when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him the prophethood. And this is a very famous incident that Ibrahim alayhi salam was thrown in the fire, and that he came out of the fire completely unharmed. This was a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even though they saw all this, they still did not believe, and he had to leave Iraq soon after because of all the other persecution that he was getting from the people over there. So after a lot of trials, he left Iraq with two people. One was his cousin Sarah alayhi salam, whom he got married to, and one was his nephew Lut alayhi salam, who was given the prophethood for a town, Sodom. We'll see that first they travel out of Iraq, and then Ibrahim alayhi salam and his wife settled in Palestine, and his nephew Lut alayhi salam was given the prophethood for a nearby town known as Sodom. Then, as they were traveling from Iraq to Palestine, they traveled through a town where the king over there, he tried to harm the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Sarah alayhi salam. So as he was trying to do that, I'm not going to go into many other details, but only the ones that are connected to understanding this story and leading to the other facts that I'm going to state. So when he tried to attack Sarah alayhi salam 3 times, he completely froze. The king realized that he cannot hurt this family, and they are very close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he apologized and let them go, and as a gift, goodbye gift, he gave them a slave girl known as, her name was Hajra alayhi salam. And I'm mentioning this part of the story because Hajra alayhi salam will also later become the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam. She will be the second wife, and some stories say that this was a suggestion by Sarah alayhi salam, the first wife. It was because they were not having any children, so she told him to marry Hajra. After that, Ibrahim alayhi salam and Hajra alayhi salam had a son. His name was Ismail. He was also given prophethood later on. However, when a baby was still very little and he was infant and still breastfeeding, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Ibrahim alayhi salam to leave Hajra and Ismail alayhi salam in Makkah. And keep in mind, it was a desert at that time, and there's this whole story that we will cover when we will be talking about Ismail alayhi salam and Hajra. For now, I need to say this so there is no confusion. Some people confuse because of the biblical stories whether this was Ismail or Ishaq, and which son was which. So I just want to make sure that you understand that this son Ismail was born with Hajra alayhi salam, and they were both left in Makkah in the desert, and it was very clear to Hajra alayhi salam as well that it was a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and she trusted her husband and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if it was a decision made by Allah, then they will not be wasted. Allah will help them. And then from there on, the story of Zamzam, and that's why we do the Sa'i, and we will cover all that when we'll be studying about the ritual of Umrah. So back in Palestine, when Ibrahim alayhi salam came back, and keep in mind he came from Iraq, settled in Palestine, and he leaves his son and second wife in the Makkah. Now he is back in Palestine, and then he had another son with Sarah alayhi salam. His name was Ishaq alayhi salam. He lived in Palestine. He was also given prophethood. So keep in mind that Ibrahim alayhi salam and Sarah alayhi salam and Ishaq alayhi salam, they all lived in Palestine. When Ishaq alayhi salam grew up, and out of his children, Yaqub alayhi salam, his son, he became the prophet. He was chosen for the prophethood. Yaqub alayhi salam was so religious. He used to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much that people started calling him Israel, which means the slave of Allah. Yani he was always busy in worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The word Israel has two parts. Isra means slave, Il means Allah. This is a Hebrew word. And just like in Arabic, slave of Allah is called Abdullah. Abd means slave and Allah means Allah. In the same way, in the Hebrew language, it was Israel. So when Yaqub alayhi salam grew up, it is still Palestine, and he had 12 sons, 10 from one wife and 2 from another wife. So the 2 younger sons were Yusuf and Binyamin, or known as Benjamin. So these 2 were younger than the other 10, and again we will study Yusuf alayhi salam's story in very much detail when we will study Surah Yusuf. For now, I want to mention that from Palestine, Yusuf alayhi salam, how did he go to Egypt? So Yusuf alayhi salam, as he was growing up, and it seemed like he will get the prophethood, the 10 other sons were very jealous of him, and they left him in a nearby well, and a trade caravan which was passing from there, they found him and they took him and sold him in Egypt. So in Egypt, he was bought by one of the ministers of Egypt, and in the start he had to go through many trials, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changed his life. So just want to remind you again, keep in mind or write down, jot down the main countries and cities that I'm mentioning and the prophets in case you think that it's becoming too much. I'm trying to introduce very few names so you don't get confused. So they were all in Palestine, and then this is the first person, Yusuf alayhi salam, through the trade caravan. He's the first person from Bani Israel who reaches the country Egypt. And then when his life changes after many years and he becomes the minister of Egypt, then he forgives and invites all his rest of his family, which was 11 brothers and the parents, to come and live in Egypt and live a better life. This is how, for the very first time now, that the entire family moves from Palestine to Egypt. And why are they called Bani Israel? Bani means sons, and Israel, I already told you, it was a nickname for Yaqub alayhi salam. So Yaqub alayhi salam's 12 sons are the Bani Israel, and when they settled in Egypt, their families and children and their parents, they were all called Bani Israel. So there were 12 tribes, and each of them had their own family and children. A huge population of Bani Israel were living in Egypt. For a few generations, they lived a good life, and after that, they were under the rule of the kings with the title Pharaoh or Pharaon, which means the sun god. So this was just a title because there were many kings that came with this title of Pharaoh. These kings made the Bani Israel their slaves. They used to make them work, and they used to make them worship the idols as well as themselves. So Bani Israel were slowly forgetting their values and all about their religion, and they were just becoming the slave mentality. They were covered, they were just living how the king was ordering them to live. So I'm mentioning this because this slave mentality is what I'm going to relate to later on as well, when they will be freed by Musa alayhi salam. Okay, so what happened that one of these kings, whose real name was Ramses, he saw a dream, or he was told by a fortune teller that one of the boys who would be born in Bani Israel's slaves families, he will grow up and destroy his kingdom, and he will put an end to all this. So Ramses, or the pharaoh of that time, became really concerned, and he ordered that all the boys from Bani Israel should be killed, and whoever will be born, they should be killed. At first, all the boys every year were killed, and then when he was told that that way we will not have any slaves in future, so he ordered that every other year the boys should be killed. During the year that the boys were supposed to be killed, Musa alayhi salam was born, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the revelation to Musa alayhi salam's mother to put the baby in a box and put the box in the river. So she did exactly that, and as a miracle and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this box landed in the backyard of the palace of Pharaoh, and it reached the hands of Asya alayhi salam, who was the wife of the Pharaoh. She was a very pious woman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave her a lot of status in this dunya, as well as there is promise that she will be one of the leader of the women in Jannah as well, inshallah. Because they did not have any children, so she insisted her husband that they should raise this boy. And Pharaoh did not agree at first, but then he said that he will test the baby, and if he passes the test, he will keep the baby. So in one end of the room, he kept burning coal, and on the other hand, he kept some gems and treasures. He said, I'll see which way the baby goes, and then I will decide. If he goes towards the gems and the precious stones, then he will be a danger for me in future, and I will not keep him. But if he goes towards the burning coal, then I will keep him. So at first, Musa alayhi salam started crawling towards the treasures and gems, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turned him with the help of Angel Jibreel alayhi salam towards a burning coal, and that's where he held the coal and burnt his tongue. It is said that it was because of this incident that Musa alayhi salam burnt his tongue in his childhood, and he used to stutter throughout his life. So Musa alayhi salam was adopted by Pharaoh and his wife, and it was a huge mercy and miracle again from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah raised him in the palace, so he grows up strong and mentally, physically, and with all the training, so he knows the whereabouts of the palace, instead of raising him in a slave family where he would not it would be almost impossible for him to approach the king when he grows up. So he is raised there, and as Musa alayhi salam grew up, he was given the prophethood, and he requested Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give him support by giving his brother the prophethood as well. So Harun alayhi salam was also the prophet at that time. These two brothers were given the two tasks. One was to guide everyone, and especially to convert Fir'aun towards Islam. And second was that if Fir'aun does not convert and does not become a Muslim, then he had to liberate the Bani Israel from Egypt and take them back to Palestine. So this is where the back to Palestine journey is going to come in place. He tried to preach to Pharaoh, but that did not work, and soon it was decided that they should take Bani Israel back to Palestine. Now this is the time they are going from Egypt. When they came, they were 2 parents and 12 sons, right? And now these are tens of thousands of people, and they are going to go back from Egypt to Palestine, where Bani Israel actually originated from. There were many miracles. One of them, we will be studying each of these miracles as the ayats come. I will tell you in a summarized form. I will present it to you. Like when they were about to leave the town, they saw that the army of Pharaoh was following them, and all the Bani Israel people panicked. And you will see throughout, also in the verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that the Bani Israel were very stubborn, very harsh, very rude, very disobedient, very ungrateful. These are the traits mostly that will be highlighted when Allah will give us examples in the Quran, and those examples are also given not just to study them as a story, but to understand and be aware that we are not supposed to do these things. Okay, so they will be finding loopholes, they will be like being using rude remarks. So when they were stuck in front of the Red Sea and behind them was the army of Pharaoh, then Musa alayhi salam was told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to strike his asa, his staff, and then the sea parted. And then Bani Israel crossed the sea, went to the other side. When Pharaoh and his army decided to cross after them, then the sea merged and they all drowned right in front of the Bani Israel. So this was a miracle again, and rahmah and blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, as I said, that as soon as they reached the other side, they said to Musa alayhi salam, they had just seen the miracle, but they told him that we want an idol to worship, just like these people, some other people were worshipping, and they saw and they got inspired. As they were going through the desert, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted their travel journey to become easier. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent them food, man and salwa from heavens whenever they would become hungry. And they were given some instructions not to save them for the next mealtime. And this is to let you know that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose them and blessed them, but they took everything for granted. Another thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them during this journey was that Allah sent lots of clouds throughout their walking time, so they would be protected from the extreme heat. And another thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them during this travel was the rock, so they can strike it and get water for all 12 tribes for their thirst. So but some examples of disobedience was that they when Musa alayhi salam was called on Mount Tur by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where he stayed for 40 days with the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they made calf out of their gold and they started worshipping that calf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent them Torah through Musa alayhi salam, and Allah had written the commands on the 2 tablets. They tried to find loopholes in that, and they always were trying to deviate from the right path. When they reached the doors of Palestine and they were instructed by Musa alayhi salam that they should go and fight the other people living there, and they were given the guarantee that they will win the fight because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with them, they still refused and they said, we are going to sit outside and you and your Rabb can go and fight. These are the kind of things that they did, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished them for 40 years. They were not able to enter Palestine. They were wandering in the desert for 40 years. They would camp and then start their day walking, and then when they would camp again, they would wake up the next morning in the exact same spot. So they were not getting anywhere for 40 years. Punishment of this wandering life for 40 years was also a way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them a chance that maybe the current generation was covered and had a slave mentality, so they were not able to do much. So it was understood that probably the next generation will be more brave and they will be able to do things in a better way. So then after 40 years, they were finally able to enter Palestine under the leadership of Yusha bin Nun, who was a student of Musa alayhi salam. By this time, Musa alayhi salam and Harun alayhi salam had both passed away, but finally reached there. So this is a brief summary of how they started from Palestine, who were Bani Israel, how they deviated, and so Palestine to Egypt to Palestine. This is generally a story of Bani Israel.